I want to underscore that I agree with everything Joe and I just said, but in sharing the research that we're doing here at the Center for New American Security, we are focused on one dimension of what we think is a solution for U.S. policy and for allied and partner policy. If we think about the U.S.-China relationship as everything from building mutual respect, as we see with Sunnyland's 2 summit meeting in Beijing, to building transparency, to building confidence-building measures, and hopefully binding rules, not also a code of conduct. We're also interested in the U.S. policy on the harder end of the spectrum. And Joe and I just asked the question, can we do anything in the South China Sea beyond what we've been doing? So if we look at U.S. policy of rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific in general as largely ways to cooperate with China, rising China, while managing competition, especially trying to avoid unnecessary competition, whether in cyberspace or in the maritime domain, how do we, in the meantime, we're trying to build that cooperation on areas where we do not agree, how do we strengthen our own position, protect our own interests, and strengthen the position and interests of allies and partners? So we've been looking at something called cross-imposition strategy. And this is a question that goes beyond what we've already talked about. We talked about deterrence working, especially in the East China Sea, and I agree with that. The question is, do we need compelling? Do we need dissuasion? Do we need the ability to do more than deter conflict, but rather to do something that imposes costs on inappropriate action, an action that basically can be considered unilateral changes to the status quo? We've called it various strategies, tactic strategies, salami tactics, incremental encroachment of sovereignty, whatever you call these incremental steps, whether it's the declaration of the 9-dash line or 10-dash line of China, whether it's the moving of rigs into disputed water, whether it's the harassment of aircraft or ships, whether it's the land reclamation of rocks into artificial islands, whether it's any of those and more, can we impose costs? Should we impose costs on those actions? Now, I do take the caveat Joe and I mentioned at the outset that, in quoting Mike McDevitt, that it's not that China is always wrong, and that's certainly not the claim here. China is the biggest actor that's changing the status quo, especially in the status quo, and in the South China Sea, but also in the East China Sea. In addition to Bob Kaplan's outstanding book, we have now the recent edition of Bill Hayton's book, The South China Sea, which does a wonderful job of looking at the early history and essentially the fact that sovereignty in these maritime domains, frankly, are very contemporary issues. Now, we're looking at U.S. policy. U.S. policy has been detecting a pattern of greater Chinese assertiveness, especially since 2009, say, when the Chinese extended that 9-dash line to the United Nations Commission on the limits of the continental shelf. Bill Hayton talks about the earlier period under Mao with the paracels in 1974, or in Johnson's South Reef in 1988, or Mischief Reef in 1995. All three of those were military incidents that the Chinese undertook to expand their influence and control over the South China Sea, well before the recent pattern of assertiveness we've seen. So, again, not to put all the onus on China, but looking at the tough issues that we're facing with China in this maritime space, what can we do? Well, in an initial paper that I put out as part of a year-long project that we're conducting, I put together a broad framework of everything that's realistic as well as just theoretical that might be done. But let me just focus on the categories that are maybe more realistic. The reputation costs are what we've been mostly focused on. And so when there's an action that is assertive, whether it's by China or another country, just trying to put the spotlight on those actions is very important for reputational costs. And we've been using the major diplomatic arenas in the region, like the ASEAN Regional Forum or the East Asia Summit, to try to impose those costs. But nobody really thinks that China, if it's really determined to expand its influence, to basically rewrite the facts on the ground in the sea and the air, is going to be dissuaded by reputational costs alone. They may change their tactics temporarily, as they did with the movement of the oil rig this summer, but they're likely to go back to probing opportunities, just as we saw with 74, 88, 1995, when there was a missed, when there was an opportunity, the Chinese didn't miss an opportunity to go ahead and exert their exercise of force. So we're looking for other things. We obviously would like to create codes of conduct and confidence-building measures, but so far the Chinese have only been willing to sign up to non-binding and voluntary codes, like the Qs, the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea that they earlier announced, which didn't go any further than they were already basically signed up to under international shipping laws, the coal regs. We've also tried to have military-to-military talks, and we've been building confidence by making sure that our navies and our militaries are talking closely. These are welcome steps, good steps, but as Admiral Harry Harris told me just a few weeks ago, when Admiral Wu, his counterpart, said, "Look, we want to have a real hotline so that we can avoid having an incident between the U.S. and the Chinese Navy at sea." And Admiral Harris said, "Well, that's great, but you know, in the past you haven't answered your phone, so I've got an idea. Why don't we just exchange mobile numbers, cell phone numbers?" And Admiral Wu was taken aback. The reason he was taken aback is because he doesn't represent an individual actor. He doesn't have the capacity to act on the part of the PLA or the CPC to take that action, whereas Admiral Harris could reasonably be given the ability to have a phone call with his counterpart just to exchange information as an incident occurred or maybe tensions were escalating. So structurally, we have problems in building these confidence-building measures. So in the meantime, there's going to be some competition. One of the things we can do is obviously build transparency. And there's a growing proliferation of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance imagery. But this imagery doesn't have 24/7 eyes on all of even the South China Sea or the East China Sea. So we're still going to see opportunistic videos on YouTube of ramming of ships and of satellite photos and aircraft photos, surveillance of the land reclamation. But getting that information out in public, debating it, is a healthy step toward making sure that whatever actions individual countries are taking is at least debated within the region with more awareness. The United States is also doing what Joe and I mentioned, which is building partnership capacity. So we're working along with Japan and others to build the Coast Guard as well as the naval and air capacity and air defense capacity of partners, allies like the Philippines, partners like Vietnam. But we're also trying to build region-wide agreement on some of these issues. The problem with region-wide architecture in Asia is that nobody agrees on what the architecture ought to be. And we have these overlapping institutions already that take up so much time and attention for this tsunami of summits that are happening right now and over the next week. The problem is that there's some really good ideas out there. There's one idea in Japan, for instance, talking about an OSCE for the maritime space. And you can imagine it broken down not into the classic human rights and military and political dimensions, but rather looking at the different dimensions of maritime cooperation, such as oil, energy, research, search and rescue, but also dealing with code of conduct so that there won't be dangerous incidents in the air or the sea. Right now, that's what we're worried about. We're worried not about the high end of war breaking out so much as these gray zones erupting into escalation of tension because we don't have any means of control. We don't have any means of waiting, especially the Chinese, but not just the Chinese, from taking steps that are dangerous. So I'll stop there with that research, other than to say that we plan to come out with a policy report in next March with policy recommendations. We're continuing our series of workshops, and we have a website where we're publishing regular papers. We have 2 more papers about to go up on the website on cost of position strategy, but also a paper that documents actions of China and the claimants in the South China Sea that have been taken in recent years. It's a very interesting matrix, all empirical, done by Dr. Christopher Young at the National Defense University. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben.